After you watch this video, you will understand the root of the political struggle which is taking place in modern Western nations. The fundamental struggle taking place in Western nations right now is universalism versus particularism. These are two distinct theological, moral frameworks, two distinct worldviews with long genealogies going back into the earliest layers of human history. The most concrete example is what is going on in England right now. The big question which is being played out in English politics is, what does it mean to be English? The left argues that anyone can be English. To be English is simply a kind of contractual obligation. Anyone who lives within England and holds an English passport is therefore English. In return for English citizenship, migrants are expected, at least in theory, to conform to English laws and perhaps to some vague English cultural values, which might be defined as either Christian or liberal depending on who you ask. Therefore, England is a territory and a vague set of values and a set of inconsistently enforced laws. The right, in contrast, defines Englishness as an inherited, intrinsic, ancestral, and ethnic identity. For the right, one is born English as part of a continuity stretching back to the earliest inhabitants of the English Isles, and one is born with an obligation to pass on the inheritance and the culture received from their ancestors, and one is born with a duty to their fellow Englishmen and to their descendants. For the right, then, England is a nation in the older sense of the word, like you hear in the Bible, the nation of Israel, meaning the people, religion, culture, continuity of the Hebrew people, of the Israelites. So here we see two distinct, directly opposed worldviews clashing. On the one hand, the universalist doctrine of liberal globalism, which is the dominant worldview and political system in the West today. On the other hand, the particularist worldview of nativism and nationalism, which is now rising everywhere in the West in response to the excesses of liberalism. And this is actually somewhat ironic, since nationalism, as opposed to monarchy, was originally an essential part of liberal doctrine. So to understand the struggle taking place in the modern West and how we ended up in this position in the first place, we have to look at the genealogy of these two clashing worldviews. Broadly, universalism is based on the idea of consensual, chosen, contractual identities. We see this in the liberal conception of nationality. A modern liberal believes one can choose their identity. One may be born Chinese, but if they move to Italy, gain Italian citizenship, and learn the language, they then become Italian, indistinguishable from an ethnic Italian. This extends to other things like gender identity. Christianity is also a universalist doctrine. One elects to join the tribe of Christ, and therefore becomes part of the spiritual tribe of Abraham upon baptism. This then overrides, or at least becomes more primary than one's inborn identity, one's ancestral, inherited identity. Particularism, by contrast, holds that your most defining identity categories are inborn, and further that they come with a duty and an obligation. Particularist worldviews are generally based on the ideas of duty, loyalty, and ancestral continuity. An example of this would be the European pagan religions of the Greek Mycenaean period before Plato, of the Roman Republican period, of the Iron Age among the Celts, and up through the Viking Age among the Germanic peoples. These religions were based on kinship and ancestry, loyalty and honor. They viewed the gods as their direct ancestors. Thus one could not adopt Germanic religion. It was an inborn identity passed down directly from one's ancestors, something innate, not chosen. In the West, universalism first appeared in Rome, firstly in the philosophical basis of Christianity, and secondly in the political doctrines of the late Roman Empire. As we just went over, the European pagan religions were based on a particularist worldview. So too was monotheistic Judaism, which was understood as a religion focused on the Jewish people and on inherited identity. But when Christianity was opened up to the Gentiles, we see the idea that anyone can be a Christian because Christianity is a contractual, chosen identity. If one is baptized and follows the teachings of Christ, then they are part of the tribe of Abraham. Since all souls begin equal before God, it is only one's chosen identity and actions that define them. If one partakes in the pact of Abraham and is a follower of Christ, they will be saved. If not, they will go to hell. And this is regardless of their ethnicity, their social status, or any other inborn attributes. When Christianity was adopted by the Romans, it was coupled with their imperial ideology. Rome began as a particular republic, focused on the religion of the Roman people, descendants of Mars. But as the Roman state expanded, the identity category of being Roman began to become less particular. Soon, the Roman state took in all the peoples of the Italic Peninsula, although not without civil war. It then expanded to encompass the entire Mediterranean. By the late Roman Empire, Rome had become an expansionist, universalist project. To be Roman was no longer to be an ethnic Roman, but rather to be under the rule of the Roman state. And here, for the first time, we see something similar to the modern liberal conception of nationality and statehood. Liberalism seeks to absorb more and more people under its universalist umbrella, asking them to disregard their customs and join the liberal system, accepting its morals and its principles. Not long after the Edict of Caracalla, issued in 212 AD, which made all inhabitants of the Roman Empire Roman citizens, the empire also converted to Christianity, a universalist religion. Thus, the particularist, nativist, ancestral conception of Roman identity was replaced with a universalist one. It would make no sense for a Jew, or a German, or an African, or a Carthaginian to worship Mars, the father of the Roman people, since Mars was not their ancestral deity. Thus, all inhabitants of the empire gave up their nationalities and their ancestral religions to take part in two propositional pacts. One, citizenship of the universalist political project of the Roman Empire, and two, the universalist religion of Christianity. Now, this is not yet to speak of any causation in regards to our modern political situation. You cannot blame Caracalla or the authors of the New Testament for the particular political situation which we find ourselves in the West today. That would be kind of ridiculous. But what I'm doing is tracing the genealogy of the ideas which we still see present in our political landscape. If you ask the average person in the West today what moral beliefs they hold, you will find that most of them trace genealogically to Christian foundations. Ask the average Westerner what the purpose of life is, and they'll probably say, to be a good person, which is to help the downtrodden. They will say that chosen identity is more important than inborn identity. They will say that all people are born equal, and so on. What's interesting, though, is that if you went back only 100 years, and certainly to the Middle Ages, and asked the average person in Europe what their beliefs were, most of those beliefs would be rooted in pagan first principles. That is, principles and values inherited from the pre-Christian religions of Europe. They would believe in ancestry, kinship, honor, and heroism. Honor duels were still being fought all the way in the 20th century. This is a tradition and value system which traces back to the pagan religions of Europe. You see this in the Iliad. You don't see any honor duels taking place in the New Testament. And let me read you a quote from one of John Adams' letters where he is talking about what Jefferson proposed for the Great Seal of the United States. Quote, Mr. Jefferson proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and on the other side, Hengist and Horsa, these Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Notice how Jefferson, at least as reported by Adams, emphasizes their pagan Anglo-Saxon heritage with such great pride. Still, during the founding of the United States, one of the few European nations that has no pagan prehistory or foundation, at least in the continent, Jefferson still felt his pagan inheritance, his ancestry, was of primary importance to his identity and to his nation. And here's what is so interesting about all of this. While most of the West has been Christian for at least 1,000 years, and some places closer to 1,500, it is only today, for the first time, that the average Westerner expresses a worldview and moral sentiment rooted entirely in Christianity and the Bible. And here is why I think that is. When Europe was converted to Christianity, the whole infrastructure of pagan belief did not disappear. A medieval Germanic king who was baptized into Christianity did not suddenly stop claiming Woden as his ancestor. He did not stop fighting for honor. He did not stop making kinship pacts or abandon the old pagan laws. He still believed in heroism as the highest ideal. He still believed in the fundamental inequality of men. He still believed in the divinity of blood. Christianity, therefore, would have been an elected identity, added on top of his particularist worldview. And this is perfectly easy to understand. We see this all the time. A Scandinavian man today might be a traditionalist and have a particularist worldview. He might even worship the old gods, Thor and Odin, yet at the same time he might consider himself a Nietzschean or a Hegelian, or maybe even a gym bro, let's say. Other adopted identities layered on top of his primary, immutable, particularist one. And even further, during the Middle Ages, Christianity, Christendom, basically became synonymous with European identity. But then during the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of nationalism and Romanticism, Europe began to swing back away from universalism and towards particularism. Monarchy and Christendom were abandoned for national sovereignty. Instead of understanding their identity in terms of a pan-European Christendom, nations began to understand themselves as fundamentally tribal, rooted in ancient inherited identities. Of course, this continuity had never really been broken, but it was a shift in the language which nations in Europe used to talk about themselves and to understand their identity. And with it came a renewed interest in ancient heroic culture. Writers like Nietzsche openly criticized Christianity. Artists like Wagner sought to bring ancient Germanic myths back to life. Scholarship on the Indo-European origins of the European peoples and their cultures was just being discovered. But after the two world wars, particularist identity became associated with destruction, and National Socialism especially was an extremely particularist worldview. So the West swung in reaction to this in the other direction. In an upcoming video, I'm going to talk about how World War II could be understood symbolically as Ragnarok. It completely destroyed the old world, and in the new world that followed, the pagan foundation of Europe was no longer really there. The only traditional foundation remaining was Christianity, with the primary ideology of the West being liberalism. And this is what explains the predicament that we're in today. Now, this is not to blame Christianity for the problems of the modern West, though I myself am a Roman pagan and have many gripes with Christianity, both theologically and historically. The political, philosophical, and ideological forces that brought us to our current situation cannot all be laid at the feet of Christianity. That would just be kind of ridiculous. When Europe began to convert, it did not necessarily follow that we'd end up where we are today. As stated before, if you were to go back to a European nation, especially in Europe in the 1800s, people would have been steeped in ancient pagan culture. They would have had a particularist, nativist worldview. But today there is none of that. People on this channel are probably the exception, but most people have no conception of the ancient beliefs and cultural practices of their ancestors, and no sense of continuity with them. In the United States, many Europeans don't even know where their ancestors came from, and when they do, it usually came from a DNA test. Of course, there's exceptions. Irish Americans and Italian Americans tend to have a stronger connection with their roots, but still they're usually not thinking back to the deeds of Cuchulainn or Aeneas or anything like that. And now the West is being destroyed by liberal universalism. When people are stripped of their identities, they are stripped of all meaning. The purpose of life becomes essentially to be a financial and political cog in the vast liberal empire. To say one is American today says almost nothing about who they are. To be born into America is not to receive any cultural or political inheritance. It is simply to be born into a type of political pact. One has citizenship, one must therefore follow the laws, and this is not a fulfilling identity. Life is given meaning by connection to those who came before us and those who will come after us, and by feeling that one belongs to a community and to an intergenerational continuity. If we look at what life is on a very fundamental level, on a biological level, life is, foundationally, something which escapes death by replicating itself every generation through reproduction. So when we, as biological organisms, are born without a connection to what came before us, we are born into a world without direction, without meaning. Sure, one might adopt a chosen identity, perhaps join a political party, or partake in some religion, build a community of like-minded people. That's all well and good. There are numerous ways to come to a meaningful life. But still, any community we might partake in or build has no continuity and is not lasting. The communities we grow up in are not the same by the time we are young adults, let alone by the time we have children. And therefore the liberal system creates a world where people have no incentive to invest in it at all, because they are not part of an identity or a community with any permanence, with any intergenerational impact. Increasingly in the West, people are struggling with meaning, struggling also just to survive, with their lives revolving entirely around money. People increasingly feel that their governments are oppressing them rather than helping them, that the governments of Western nations no longer exist to serve their peoples, but rather to exploit them economically and to strip them further of their identities, their communities, and what they find meaningful in life. Beautiful buildings are torn down, cheap ones are built to house foreigners imported to artificially inflate the economy. Culture is degraded and forgotten, and more we are left only with cheap and simple pleasures. Liberal universalism is what is causing the swing in the other direction. Anyone in the West who is somewhat awake or has any kind of foresight recognizes that this current way of life is not sustainable. And so young people are looking to history, to religion, to more ancient foundational identities to give their lives meaning and fulfillment. When a culture is almost entirely materialistic, people begin to ask, what is unique and intrinsic about me? What makes me unique is not just how nice my car is or how good my job is, what kind of movies I like, what sports team I support, or even the way I vote. It must be something deeper than that. And in part, I think this is what has spawned all the strange identity politics in the West around gender and that sort of thing. But this is also why nativism and nationalism are on the rise, and why I believe a revival of European paganism will accompany this political shift. I think we are, or at least could be, on the verge of something very similar to the pagan Renaissance that swept across Europe during the Renaissance and the rise of Romanticism. During the Renaissance, the Italians looked back to their ancient Roman pagan past for inspiration and to reforge their identity and reshape their culture, and they did so successfully, producing one of the greatest artistic movements of history. Some of the finest sculptures, like the Perseus, come not from ancient Rome, but from the Renaissance. Machiavelli explicitly criticized Christianity, calling Italy to return to a Roman republican form of government. He argued that Christianity made people think too much about the salvation of their souls and not enough about fighting for their country and their countrymen. Here already in the Renaissance, we see someone critiquing Christianity and universalism from a nativist nationalist perspective, seeking to return to an ancient Roman past. In the Protestant Reformation, the Germanic world rebelled against the Catholic Church, establishing a form of Christianity rooted not in Jerusalem or Rome, but in the Germanic world with Martin Luther. This set the stage for a revival of Germanic identity. Across Europe, monarchies were overthrown and replaced with national identities established along ancient tribal lines. The framework of Roman imperialism and Christendom began to break down. What we have now is a liberal political order with universalist underpinnings, rooted on the right in Christianity and on the left in various liberal and leftist philosophies that hold essentially the same universalist principles. And I believe that this structure is going to break, and soon. It cannot be sustained just as the Roman Empire could not. Now, we're all very familiar with the universalist propositional ideas about meaning and identity, which are prevalent today. But let me just point out a few examples. But we also see the idea of propositional identity extended to gender. The leftist claim is that gender is a mere role that one adopts, and if one elects to be another gender, then that chosen identity overrides their inborn, inherited, biological identity. The left even uses the term gender assigned at birth to indicate that how one is born has no power or authority over the individual. Since a baby is not yet conscious, they did not voluntarily elect to enter into the role of their gender, and therefore, in the liberal's mind, that inherited biological gender has no authority over them. Since identity is contractual and the baby cannot agree to the contract of their gender identity, it is invalid. This type of thinking, though, is also prevalent among conservatives, just around different subjects. You will often hear conservatives argue that race is simply skin color, and that it is what one does in life that defines them, their elected religion, their job, their moral stance, etc., with skin color merely being a peripheral and happenstance characteristic. And this might sound idealistic and all of that, but obviously people identify very much with their race, with their own people. So while the American right has the left pinned on the gender issue, it's actually the left who ironically understand the importance of ethnic identity. They argue that ethnicity and culture are central, inborn categories, and that one has an obligation to support one's kinsmen, essentially. Take BLM as an example of this. So while both the right and the left may come into contact with reality on some issues, overall both sides operate from a universalist and propositional worldview. And this is because the most conservative position one can have in mainstream American politics is to be something like a Christian nationalist. And Christianity, as we've discussed, is a universalist religion, and especially so now that it lacks the pagan foundation and framework that was present in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, which enforced a particularist framework. The particularist, ancestral, duty-based worldview, which was once the core of Western civilization from our earliest recorded records in the Bronze Age well into the 20th century, now seems foreign, even scandalous and heretical to the average Westerner. So far I've talked a lot about universalism, but what does a particularist worldview look like? I think the best way to understand this is to start with the idea of ancestral continuity, and I will use the European pagan religions as an example since I know a lot about them, and because they are a well-recorded example of an ancestral, almost aggressively anti-universalist worldview. The European pagan worldview, as found among the ancient Greeks, the Romans, Celts, Germanic peoples, and so on, begins with the idea that life's meaning is found in the ancestral chain of being. You are given life by your parents, and collectively by your ancestors. You are born, therefore, with a sacred duty to your ancestors, and to continue the chain of being, to pass on the flame of life, and the institutions and traditions which protect it and encourage it. This is why Odysseus gives up Calypso's offer of personal immortality and godhood in order to return to his family and to save his son. One is also born in the pagan worldview with an obligation to one's kin. This is why Achilles gives up a long life as a king, surrounded by comforts and concubines, to avenge the death of his dear companion and kinsman Patroclus. In this worldview, therefore, joy and meaning are taken from family, from children, from an honorable man who behaves virtuously towards his kin and vengefully towards the enemies of his kin, and who embarks on great deeds so that he and his children inherit a glorious name that enriches his ancestral line. I've talked a lot about the European pagan worldview, its values, and theology on this channel, so I don't want to get sidetracked with that here. So let these two examples suffice. Odysseus valued his family, his lineage, his kingdom, and his name more than an eternity spent as a god, and Achilles valued taking vengeance for the death of his friend and kinsman more than a long, happy life as a king. And now, what would it look like if a modern person held this worldview? They would believe that they had a duty to safeguard the civilization which their ancestors built and passed to them. They would believe that they had a duty to pass their country and culture on to their children in a healthy and flourishing state, so that their children might flourish as well, and to build upon what their ancestors built. They would feel a sacred duty to their kinsmen, to their ancestors, to their country, to their descendants. They would feel the desire to live up to the greatness of their ancestors. and if they found their country and culture in a derelict state, they would feel a duty to enrich and uplift it so that their descendants would inherit something great and glorious, and they would feel that no amount of personal comfort or riches could outweigh the meaning which these sacred duties provide. Let's contrast this with ideas prominently pushed in Western societies today. You have no obligation to your ancestors. You can be whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You have no obligation to your kinsmen. You have no obligation to create a better world for your descendants. In fact, sacrificing your well-being, the well-being of your country, and the well-being of your descendants for others is actually virtuous. You are an individual. Your life begins when you are born and ends when you die. There is no before or after. You have no inheritance and will leave no inheritance. In fact, you should probably give away your fortune to some charity in another country instead of leaving it to your children. That would be the moral thing to do. The only worthwhile pursuits in life are being a good person, which amounts to helping the downtrodden and poor, and living a happy, long, pleasurable life. In fact, if you're of European descent, being concerned with honoring your ancestors, enriching your country, or securing your own legacy is, in fact, pathological. Now, the worldview of a modern conservative will be closer to the first worldview that I described than the second, and people who are attracted to conservatism tend to be Christian. However, ironically, when compared with the ancestral pagan worldview, the first principles of Christianity fall much closer to modern liberalism. And of course, this is partly because modern liberalism derives its first principles from Christian thought or Christian-influenced thought. Early Christians were called to give up their ancestral gods and ethnic identities and to join the spiritual clan of Abraham, of Christ. As Paul famously wrote, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Here, elected identity by chosen pact, supersedes and overrides inborn and inherited identity. All that matters is whether one's personal soul is saved or damned, whether one joins in the pact of Christ. The goal of one's life then is to act morally, which is to help the downtrodden, which will secure oneself personal immortality. This supersedes obligation to one's countrymen, ancestors, and family. In fact, in contrast to modern Christian conservatism, celibacy was upheld as the ideal in early and even in medieval Christianity. Reproduction was for the laymen, those not godly enough to renounce the flesh. In later Arthurian literature, Galahad can only find the Grail because he is a virgin. Upon finding it, he instantly dies and is taken to heaven. Lancelot, in contrast, is condemned for his affair with Guinevere, and both become celibate monks. Again, contrast this with Odysseus, who turned down immortality for the sake of his lineage. Another example is Signy from the saga of the Volsungs. After her father and 9 of her brothers were murdered by her husband, she went to extreme and cruel lengths to avenge them and secure her bloodline, endorsing the murder of her own children and even sleeping with her brother. Once vengeance was taken, however, she felt she had committed too many crimes to live and let herself be burned to death with her husband. She valued her kin and her ancestral line so greatly that, like Achilles, she had no regard for her own conscience or life. Her soul and her own personal moral standing never came into the picture here. She did everything for her family and for her lineage. This kind of devotion to one's ancestors and kin may seem extreme, and of course this is an extreme example from a saga, but sacrificing your children's lives and well-being, throwing away the cultures and civilizations which our ancestors built over generations of sacrifice, is an even more extreme position. The truth is, without that kind of devotion to your ancestors, to your civilization, and to your descendants, you would not exist. You would not enjoy the things you enjoy today. A key and obvious component of a particularist worldview is that it favors the particular over the universal. Universalist worldviews like liberalism claim that something is only true or good if it applies to all peoples at all times. Both Christianity and liberalism make claim to absolute truth. They claim that their morality, their theological principles are true for all people, everywhere, always, and therefore that they are good and true. But particularist worldviews make the opposite valuation. They assert that something which is open to all, or true for all, is of no value. It is specificity, particularity, and exclusivity that gives things meaning. You could make a crude but revealing analogy here to an open relationship. For most people, what is valuable about a relationship is its exclusivity. You love your girlfriend, your wife, your husband, because they are yours, because they have attributes which others don't. You'll often hear people today saying, "We're all human." This is because liberalism seeks to minimize our differences in its pursuit of universality. This is why it has a homogenizing effect on society. Though liberals will speak of multiculturalism, this is not actually desirable because of so-called diversity, but because multiculturalism makes it so that there is no prevailing culture, at least in any meaningful way. Since culture requires some sort of basic normative standard, and none can exist if everyone you meet is from a different place, practicing a different religion, holding different moral, social, and societal expectations. Thus, in practice, a multicultural society has no culture. Thus, liberalism leads to a cultureless society, as we have in America today. And a society without any cultural standards or expectations is a society with no trust, loyalty, or social cohesion, since you are unlikely to share the ancestry, religion, culture, values, perhaps even the same language as your neighbors, and therefore there's little cause to invest in the culture or nation, since you have no ownership of it, no claim to it, and it doesn't support your specific interests, beliefs, and desires. In this case, the government is forced to be universal, since its people are so diverse that almost no action can cater to the wants and needs of all of them at once. You see this in America today, since there are so many different factions with directly opposed interests and desires. No policy or government can satisfy all of them at once, let alone even several of them at once. The nation thus becomes an economic and legal domain with a multitude of factions fighting over control of it or seeking to best exploit it. And this obviously cannot last very long. Now, I've been ragging on liberalism quite a bit here, but isn't there something appealing, something true about the pursuit of universalism, about the pursuit of universal truth? Isn't it noble to seek to find a doctrine that is true everywhere, always? Isn't this what gave Christianity an advantage over the pagan religions? Isn't this what has allowed liberalism to spread so quickly? Well, I actually don't think so, because any claim to universal truth is by its very nature deceptive and false. Let's take, again, another practical, biological example. What is biological life? This is something that even scientists find hard to define. The question of whether viruses count as life forms is a controversial question, but we can make broad definitions. We could say that life forms could be broadly defined as growing, self-replicating entities with some sort of agency. But really that tells us little about what life actually is. If we want to understand what life forms are, what drives life, we'd do best looking at specific examples, specific species, and specific behaviors. It's in the details, it's in specificity, that the incredible and miraculous nature of life gets revealed. As longtime watchers of the channel will know, I've spent a ton of time trying to get at the nature of biological life in philosophical and religious terms, and I usually strip it down to the drives towards growth and expansion, and the necessarily corresponding drive for consumption and domination. This is a good way to understand the basic drives and behaviors of life. On a basic biological level, we are organisms that eat food in order to grow. At a more abstract behavioral level, we are not satisfied with a life of mere survival, because we are driven to explore, to compete, to conquer. All that is well and good. However, this is only interesting insofar as it explains specific behaviors and specific manifestations of biological life. If I were to introduce myself as a self-replicating entity with some sort of agency, motivated by instincts derived from the fundamental drive towards growth, that would tell you almost nothing about me. It would sound like nonsense word salad. Yes, from the most broad perspective, I am a life form, and this broad category is important for understanding what I am. But more specifically, I am a eukaryote. I have cells with nuclei. I am part of the Animalia kingdom, meaning I am multicellular and have some sort of motile agency. And there are 18 different, increasingly specific classifications which we could go through here. I am a vertebrate organism. I am a mammal. I am part of the primate order. I am a Homo sapien. And maybe here you might be able to ascertain some general expectations for what I am and how I behave. But of course, even among humans, we see a vast diversity of cultures, behaviors, dispositions, etc., both between groups and individuals. Because of the evolutionary nature of life, biological organisms can only really be understood within their context, within the context of their environment, but more importantly, the context of their evolutionary history, which is also partially the history of their environment. Both I, a beetle, and a fig tree are all life forms, but how we behave, what we need to survive and thrive, differs radically. A particularist worldview makes the claim that the same is true among people, and among peoples. Each people has a culture, religion, civilization, and history which is uniquely theirs, which both shaped and is a product of their nature. Liberalism, as we talked about before, attempts to deny this and essentially aims at stripping all people of their culture, since multiculturalism only works if all parties give up their unique culture and interests. Of course, this is never going to happen. People don't operate like this. But liberalism begins from the belief that everyone is a blank slate and culture is merely happenstance. But as we know from the animal kingdom, animals are closely adapted to their environments. This is what Darwin observed with the finches. And for humans, our environment and our ancestral history is our culture, because it is what has shaped us into who we are. And someone might say, well, who cares? We've grown past all that. Modern humans do not need religion or culture. We can all live happily side by side. All we need is to be understanding, peaceful, and accepting of others. But the fundamental problem is that liberalism, or any universalist worldview, despite its claim to universality, is asking people to conform to a very specific set of values and norms, ones which are, fundamentally, unnatural. People are not born as a blank slate. The mere pursuit of wealth and pleasure is not satisfying. Religion, culture, and tribe are not things that we can move past, or that people want to move past. They are in fact essential elements of human life, and as far as we can tell, probably have been for hundreds of thousands of years, and people are fundamentally unhappy without them. Most of the problems that Christianity runs into also are a result of its universalism. Christianity claims to be the one universal moral and theological truth. Firstly, its values are clearly posited from an extremely human perspective, and moreover from a specific historical perspective. Billions of animals have walked this planet. Why are they not even mentioned in Christian theology? All of nature, according to the Bible, is a drama for man alone. Man fell from Eden, condemning all life to mortality through Christ. So what about the multi-million-year-long evolutionary history of life? What about the billions of ants going about their incredibly complex lives? Did you know ants fight wars and have hospitals? What about the suffering of monkeys who are clearly complex and thoughtful beings? I know this probably all sounds like Reddit tier criticism of Christianity, and those who watch this channel will know that I'm very sympathetic to religion. But I think you can see how the universalism inherent in Christianity causes it theological and moral problems. I watched some Netflix documentary a while ago about chimps, and when the alpha chimp was dying, he wandered off into the woods. His best friend found him and held his hand while he died. Do those chimps have a chance at redemption? Do they have souls? What about other extinct hominid species, like Neanderthals? Were they in Eden? And not only that, but anatomically modern man, that is, human beings in a form essentially identical to us, have been around for 300,000 years. What happened to all those souls? Then let's zoom back into Christianity, a religion rooted... Now let's zoom back in on Christianity, a religion rooted in the specific historical manifestation of Hebrew religion and theology, taking Zoroastrian and Platonic influence. Speaking of the end times in terms of Israel versus Rome. positing that the end times are near, just around the corner, which, by the way, has been believed since the time of Christ. So it becomes pretty clear that Christianity then is a specific historic and human religion, one which has branched off into different forms: Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, as it conforms to the culture and nature of the various peoples who adopt it. Christianity, as part of human culture, therefore necessarily adheres to evolutionary laws, changing over time, branching off into different forms, heading in different theological and moral directions. Christianity naturally becomes particular, as it is adopted by particular cultures. And it is these particular forms of Christianity that traditionalists seek to return to. For example, specific medieval versions of Christianity, many of which were a blend of pagan culture and Christianity. And Christianity creates no problems when it is paired with a particularist worldview. Of course, there is naturally tension there, there's naturally a contradiction there, but it can be done, as we have seen historically in Europe. And then it's not an issue because Christianity sits within the particularist worldview. And that is true of anything, such as liberalism. The basic problem is that culture is by its nature particular. Culture has to be particular. Culture inevitably becomes particular. And all universalist projects have always failed and fractured. The more ambitious, the worse the collapse. Context gives us direction and meaning. If you woke up with amnesia tomorrow, you wouldn't know what to do with yourself. And humans are meant to live within the context of their tribe, their culture, their community, and the extremely important context of its history. Could we live in a world where this is completely stripped away, the world that liberalism is creating? Perhaps, but only for a short while. It would quickly collapse because no one would have a buy-in to the culture, nation, or civilization, and no one would be getting what they wanted out of it. And again, this is what we're seeing in America today. Odysseus was only able to survive his 10-year journey because of his love and loyalty for his home, for his family. When I was in high school, I read this author, Daniel Quinn, who was a leftist primarily concerned with environmentalism, which is a concern that I am not unsympathetic towards. He referred to his philosophy as new tribalism. He believed that people had to return to a tribal state of living. He was concerned with the environment and how man's lifestyle affects the planet, and therefore he viewed man in terms of his long evolutionary history. And this, of course, leads to the conclusion that man fundamentally is a tribal animal, which he always has been. Daniel Quinn advocated that these new tribes be formed along the lines of common interests, but obviously identity goes much deeper than what you're interested in. And this is why liberal society is unsatisfying. People already naturally organize themselves around kinship, religion, and culture, which are much stronger and more stable common identities than anything based on shared interests. And why is that? Again, we come to the idea of inheritance. Interests and lifestyle preferences are not things which are inherited, or at least not with as much certainty as your genetic code and your ancestors' history, which is inherited from your parents. What gives us meaning is not just community, but community which is part of a continuity, an intergenerational continuity. But anyway, I bring up Daniel Quinn to illustrate that even when you come at identity from a leftist perspective, it's impossible to deny that people want to belong to communities. And communities are satisfying when they're built around things which are lasting, whether that's infrastructure, like an actual physical community, or culture and institutions, something like the church, religions, traditions, or even genes. What makes life meaningful is being part of a continuity, having children, building things that will last, doing things that will be remembered. This is why I created my heroic literature course. In the West, we've largely lost the context that gives us direction and meaning as individuals. Few know about the history of their people. Few in the West know about the history of their ancestors, the deeds of their ancestors, the religions of their ancestors, the great traditions and literature, the great poems which passed from generation to generation for centuries, the ancient continuity which they are a part of, not by preference, but by inheritance. When I first became interested in European history, especially the history of pre-Christian Europe, I began to realize that I am part of a continuity, a civilization, a culture, a religious project stretching back to the Bronze Age. And this made my life feel much more directed and meaningful because I had a greater context that I could understand myself within. I no longer felt that I was entirely cast adrift in the sea of modernity. Liberalism has been a grand and, in many ways, a lofty and idealistic project, but as all universalist projects must, it has failed. It is now up to us to lay the foundations of whatever comes next, to be founders, builders, destroyers of the old order, and creators of the new. And what greater task could there be?
If you're interested in a detailed exploration of the Greco-Roman epic cycle and the Norse sagas, follow the link in the description to check out the ARC's Heroic Literature course.